My own direct psychiatric examination of the individual continues to be, an important part of that evaluation process, and so certainly that's central to it. Then, in addition to that, you would review other records and documents that could be gathered. These could be, in a criminal case, they could be records and documents or information about the crime itself, other police reports, a variety of kinds of information that might be available. Other records and documents could include other treatment records, other past information about the documents that relate to other past information about the individual. Often you're looking for records and documents for other family members as well, particularly since there are certain psychiatric disorders that are genetic and run in families, and so sometimes records from other family members might be helpful as well. Then you can attempt to gather information from other family members and people who've known the individual over time, having them interviewed and gathering information from them, not only about their lives, but what they know about the individual that you're evaluating, what they've seen at various different points in time. And then sometimes different tests might be indicated if there are particular questions for which testing can be helpful.
Now, what's the standard for determining if a person is criminally responsible in Massachusetts?
The standard is that whether by virtue of a mental disease or defect that the individual lacks a substantial capacity to either appreciate the wrongfulness of their conduct or their ability to control their conduct.
Now, do you have an opinion to a reasonable degree of medical certainty as to whether at the time of the offense, as a result of a mental disease or defect, Philip Chism lacked the substantial capacity to appreciate the wrongfulness of his conduct or to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law?
Yes, I do.
And what is that opinion?
It's my opinion that as a result of a mental disease or defect, he lacked substantial capacity to conform his conduct to the requirements of the law.
Now, what mental disease or defect did you find that Philip Chism suffered from?
It's my opinion that he suffers from what in DSM-4 was called a psychotic disorder, NOS. In DSM-5 is called unspecified schizophrenia spectrum and other psychotic disorder.
And what can you tell us what that illness is?
Well, in both cases, whether you're talking about the DSM-4 or the DSM-5 term, we're talking, as I indicated earlier, we're talking about the DSM. It's divided into broad categories, and so one of those categories is kind of schizophrenia and the other psychotic disorders, and under that are the specific disorders. This diagnosis that we're talking about here indicates that it's your opinion that he has a sufficient number of symptoms that he should be in that broad category of unspecified schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, but that you lack some piece of information that helps you to say with a degree of certainty which specific one it is.
Now, do you have an opinion as to the age of onset of this illness in Philip Chism?
Yes, I do.
And what is that?
At about the age of 10.
And could you explain the basis of your opinion?
I'll allow it based on the parameters outlined in Commonwealth versus Nardi and other cases as well.
Could you explain generally the basis of your opinion? that he's had it since that age?
The basis of my opinion is that the symptoms that are relevant to making the diagnosis first began to appear at that age.
And what are the symptoms that are relevant to the diagnoses?
Well, with early onset, you're looking for either delusions or auditory hallucinations as symptoms. You're looking at the fact that these delusions or auditory hallucinations interfere with behavior in some sort of way.
Pardon me, I'm sorry.
They interfere with a person's ability to function in some sort of way. And there can be other, what we call softer symptoms. So, for example, there can be a impaired affect. Your affect is the external representation of how you feel. And in people who suffer from this disorder, often their affect is blunt and expressionless and what we call flat, so that you're not able to see how they're feeling from the external representation of your facial expression, things like that.
Does the DSM-5 that we talked about earlier provide guidance on its use in a forensic setting?
Yes.
And could you explain?
Well, as I indicated earlier, the DSMs in general are basically designed as to really help clinicians communicate with each other, and so to know what an evaluator might, what evaluator's thinking is going on and how to communicate that with another clinician who might be involved in the individual's care. So it's really not designed as a tool for people who are health and mental health professionals to communicate with anybody else, including a court or a jury or whomever. And it's really, that's number one. Number two is that, the rendering of a diagnosis is not particularly responsive to the questions that are often before a court. The questions that are before the court are usually, does this person have symptoms as a result of a mental illness that have impacted on their behavior in some sort of way? And so certainly a presentation of symptoms and how it's impaired behavior is more relevant than a particular diagnosis to the question before court.
Were the symptoms that you determined Philip Chism suffered from consistent with this diagnosis?
Yes.
Now, do you have an opinion if he was suffering from this illness on October 22nd, 2013?
Yes, I do.
And what is your opinion?
That he was.
Now, how did this illness affect his ability to conform his behavior?
Well, as I indicated, one of the major symptoms of this is auditory hallucinations, and that at times those auditory hallucinations can be what we call command hallucinations, which means that they're so strong and so compelling that you're unable to resist them, and it's in that way that they can affect behavior in such a way that you're unable to control your behavior.
Now, how does this illness affect children as they grow?
Well, even when the illness starts in adults, it's obviously a disruptive illness that can significantly impair their ability to function. In children, you have something else going on. The intensity of the difficulties can ebb and flow like they do in adults. Children are sometimes able to engage in activities that kind of help distract them from the symptoms, and so sometimes that helps them manage the symptoms somewhat better. But the larger issue is that children are developing, and so that the other developmental work of childhood and adolescence, the kinds of skills and things that children and adolescents are learning as they grow up, are affected by the fact that they have this illness going on at the same time. And so it's going to interfere with normal growth and development.
And what is the course of this illness?
The course of this illness is variable. Again, with the onset of children, many of these children go on to to more clearly, as you see the course over time, it more clearly begins to look like schizophrenia. Over time, you may find that it was related to other issues instead or as well. So, for example, complex trauma-related syndromes can present with this kind of pattern of psychotic symptoms. So it's somewhat variable as you watch these children move into young adult life.
Thank you. Now, did you conduct interviews with Mr. Chism?
Yes, I did.
And what is the purpose of of this type of interview with a client?
Well, the purpose is multiple. You're gathering a history, so you're trying to get as much information that he can give you about his life over time. In the course of doing that, you're looking for any particular psychosocial stressors or other stressful events that may have resulted in difficulties that are significant. You're looking for any experiences that may be symptomatic of some sort of mental illness that he might describe to you. And when you're doing that, you then try to explore those symptoms in detail with him to see whether he describes them in such a way that are consistent with what we know about how these symptoms present, as opposed to whether they're described in such a way that it simply reflects kind of a popular notion about what some of these symptoms are like. So you're constantly doing what we call a mental status examination, where you're making an assessment of a variety of mental functions, things like memory, things like affect that we were talking about already, or mood, or whether he's having problems thinking or figuring things out or reasoning in some sort of way. And then you're also trying to gain a larger history of the family as much as the individual can report it, to see whether there's any sort of family or larger problems, not just genetic mental health problems, but difficulties under which the person has grown and developed.
And do you discuss what was going around the time of the offense?
Yes, you also eventually get to the point where you talk about the offense, you talk about what they can remember about the offense, what was going on, what were they thinking, what were they feeling at the time of the offense. So yes. And you're talking about that in light of then other information that you reviewed about the offense. And
do you discuss past and present symptoms?
Yes.
What symptoms would be important to evaluate for?
Well, it would be important to evaluate for any psychiatric symptoms that have come up, regardless of whether they're the type of symptoms that can result in impaired functioning that's so severe that it would meet the criteria that we've been talking about. In most cases, when you do these evaluations, you may find symptoms, but not of a level that would meet this standard. But you would still evaluate those symptoms.
Now, how many times did you meet with Mr. Chism?
I met with him 7 times.
And could you tell us the dates of those meetings?
I first met with him in March of 2015 on the 16th and then on the 17th. I met with him in April of 2015 on the 6th, in May of 2015 on the 26th, and then I met with him in September of 2015 on the 8th and 9th, and then I met with him December 3rd.
2015.
2015.
Now, how long were each of those meetings?
They varied. Sometimes I was there for hours. Sometimes he didn't want to continue or was finding it difficult to tolerate it, and so that I may have been there only for 2 hours or something.
Yes.
Over the course of the interviews, did you make observations of Philip Chism?
Yes, I did.
And what were your observations?
I observed that in the interviews that I had with him, that his affect was very flat, that there were times when he would kind of be staring off to space and not really paying attention to me. There were times where he appeared to be kind of mumbling to himself, and as opposed to paying attention to or engaged to with me. He was often finding it difficult to organize his thoughts, or even find the words to be responsive to questions that I was asking. Sometimes he would talk about things a lot. Sometimes he would say, "I don't remember, I don't know," that sort of thing. He talked about not wanting to remember some things, particularly about his early.
I'll sustain the objection as to that last area, but the part of the question about affect that includes not wanting to remember things may remain, and from because and whatever was going to come after that, the objection sustained.
And I object. Now, did Philip Chism tell you what he was experiencing?
Yes.
What did Philip Chism tell you?
Sustained.
Objection. Now, do you have an opinion about what symptoms Philip Chism was experiencing during your interviews?
Yes.
What's that opinion?
It's my opinion that he was experiencing auditory hallucinations. It's my opinion that his thinking was disorganized. And it's my opinion that there was some what we call thought blocking.
Do you have an opinion on whether the auditory hallucinations were affecting his ability to cooperate in the interviews?
Yes, I do have an opinion on that.
What's your opinion?
I have an opinion that the auditory hallucinations were making it difficult for him to cooperate with me during the course of the examinations.
Do you have an opinion on whether the voices ebbed and flowed during the interviews with Mr. Chism?
I have an opinion that with regard to the intensity of the voices during the different interviews. Is that what you mean? As opposed to, okay, yeah.
Okay,
And
can I just be comfortable one moment, sidebar?
Now, do you have an opinion on whether Philip